How did 2 decades of war transform the U.S. national debt? In this video, we are about to know the numbers and discover the long-lasting impact of America's war on terror. Let's get it. Number 1. The War on Terror in Afghanistan, 2001 to 2021. The September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks triggered a profound transformation in U.S. foreign and domestic policy, initiating the global war on terror and prompting a prolonged military intervention in Afghanistan. Within weeks of 9/11, the U.S. military launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a swift response aimed at dismantling al-Qaeda and overthrowing the Taliban. Yet what began as a targeted mission quickly turned into a 20-year-long campaign with a tremendous human and financial cost. In 2001, before the War on Terror, the U.S. national debt stood at $5.8 trillion. As military operations expanded, so did the financial burden. Between 2001 and 2008, the U.S. national debt nearly doubled to $10 trillion. A significant portion of this increase is directly attributed to the Afghanistan war, which cost over $2 trillion, covering military operations, reconstruction efforts, and long-term commitments to veterans' care. Beyond direct military costs, post-9/11 domestic expenditures on homeland security contributed to rising federal spending. The newly established Department of Homeland Security required vast resources to secure borders, airports, and critical infrastructure against future terrorist threats. Despite the drawdown of U.S. troops in Afghanistan in 2021, the financial obligations of this conflict persist. Ongoing care for veterans, payments to private contractors, and the maintenance of a residual military presence continue to add to the national debt. By 2019, the U.S. debt had climbed to $22 trillion. Number 2, the Iraq War, 2003 to 2011. Just 2 years after the Afghanistan invasion, the U.S. launched another major conflict, the Iraq War. Justified by the need to eliminate weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and topple Saddam Hussein, the invasion of Iraq added another layer of financial strain. The Iraq War unfolded alongside the Afghanistan conflict, stretching U.S. military and financial resources thin. At the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, the national debt stood at $6.8 trillion. However, by the time major combat operations ended in 2011, the debt had ballooned to $14.8 trillion. The Iraq War's financial impact is estimated at over $1.9 trillion, including combat operations, reconstruction efforts, and humanitarian aid. The economic burden of the war extended beyond these direct costs, as the interest on war-related borrowing also contributed to the national debt. Costs escalated quickly during the early years of the Iraq War. Between 2003 and 2006, over $500 billion was spent on combat operations, procurement of military equipment, and reconstruction. Another $700 billion was spent between 2007 and 2011 on maintaining the U.S. presence in counterinsurgency operations. The broader economic implications of the war continued to compound, with interest payments on war-related borrowing exceeding $400 billion by 2020. Number 3. Long-term financial implications. Veterans' care and security costs. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq left an enduring legacy, with long-term financial implications that extend well beyond direct military spending. Over 2.8 million U.S. service members have been deployed to these conflicts, and the costs associated with their care, particularly for those with physical and psychological injuries, will persist for decades. By 2020, the Department of Veterans Affairs, VA, had spent $346 billion on medical care, disability compensation, and other benefits for veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. These costs are expected to rise significantly in the coming years. Estimates suggest that by 2050, the total cost of veterans' care related to these conflicts will exceed $1 trillion. This includes medical treatments, disability payments, and the construction of specialized facilities for long-term care. The nation faces an ongoing financial obligation to provide for the soldiers who have served. Besides, maintaining a military presence and conducting security operations in both Afghanistan and Iraq has added an additional $20 to $30 billion annually to federal spending. The broader economic impact of these conflicts is not limited to direct combat operations. The U.S. government has also had to invest in nation-building efforts, infrastructure development, and training allied forces. These expenditures have further contributed to the national debt and have had long-term consequences for U.S. fiscal policy. Number 4. Syria and ISIS, 2014 to present. The emergence of ISIS in 2014 prompted renewed military operations in the Middle East, primarily focusing on Syria and Iraq. Though these operations were on a smaller scale than the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they still required substantial financial investment. By 2014, the U.S. national debt had risen to $17.8 trillion, driven in part by military expenditures in response to ISIS. U.S. involvement in Syria was primarily focused on airstrikes, intelligence support, and training allied forces to combat ISIS. The estimated cost of these operations reached $28 billion by 2021. While these costs were lower than those of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, they still added to the overall financial burden on the federal government. Moreover, the fight against ISIS required the continued deployment of military personnel and the maintenance of strategic bases in the region, further straining the national budget. Number 5. Additional factors contributing to the debt surge. Foreign wars, particularly in Afghanistan and Iraq, have played a significant role in driving up the U.S. national debt. However, several other major events and policies have also contributed to the debt surge, particularly in the 2000s and 2010s. The 2008 global financial crisis triggered a severe recession, resulting in reduced tax revenues and necessitating massive government bailouts for financial institutions. The Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, and subsequent economic stimulus packages, which totaled more than $700 billion, were critical in preventing a total collapse of the financial system. However, these measures added substantially to the national debt. In addition to the financial crisis, various tax cuts implemented in 2001, 2003, and 2017 also reduced government revenues while military expenditures remained high. For example, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 led to a revenue loss of over $1.5 trillion over 10 years, exacerbating the national debt problem. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic triggered a new wave of government spending. The CARES Act and other stimulus measures injected over $4 trillion into the economy between 2020 and 2021. By the end of 2021, the U.S. national debt had surpassed $27 trillion. Number 6, impact on debt-to-GDP ratio. One of the most important metrics for evaluating a country's financial health is the debt-to-GDP ratio, which compares national debt to overall economic output. In 1999, the U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio was around 58%, a relatively manageable figure. However, as military operations expanded and economic crises emerged, this ratio grew rapidly. Debt-to-GDP ratio by year: 2008, 68%, 2013, 100%, 2020, 128%, 2024, projected 99%. The rise in the debt-to-GDP ratio underscores the long-term consequences of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. As the U.S. borrowed heavily to fund these conflicts, combined with domestic crises like the 2008 financial meltdown and the COVID-19 pandemic, it became increasingly challenging for the country to manage its debt load effectively. Number 7, the cost of servicing the debt. As the national debt grew, so too did the cost of servicing it. By 2023, annual interest payments on the national debt reached $726 billion, consuming 14% of total federal spending. This represents a significant ongoing financial obligation, one that will only increase as the debt continues to grow. Projections indicate that by 2029, annual interest payments on the debt will surpass $1 trillion, outpacing discretionary spending on defense and other essential government services. As interest payments balloon, they will crowd out other critical investments, limiting the government's fiscal flexibility. Number 8, global implications of U.S. debt. The U.S. national debt has far-reaching implications beyond its borders. As of 2021, approximately 33% of public debt was held by foreign entities, including major creditors such as China and Japan. This foreign ownership of debt adds an international dimension to the U.S. fiscal situation, making it a critical factor in global financial markets and geopolitical relations. Foreign ownership of U.S. debt as of 2023. China, $870 billion. Japan, $1.1 trillion. These relationships complicate U.S. foreign policy, as economic decisions must consider the interests of these significant foreign stakeholders. Managing the U.S. national debt effectively requires not only addressing domestic fiscal issues, but also navigating the complex dynamics of international debt markets. The legacy of war on the national debt. The U.S. national debt has surged from $5.7 trillion in 1999 to over $33 trillion by 2023, representing an increase of more than 500%. While it is difficult to attribute a specific portion of this debt solely to war, estimates suggest that several trillion dollars are directly or indirectly linked to military engagements in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. The long-term consequences of war-related spending will continue to shape the U.S. economy for decades, as interest payments, veterans' care, and the costs of maintaining military and security infrastructure weigh heavily on the federal budget. The financial impact of these wars will be felt for years to come, shaping the future of the U.S. economy. Want to stay informed on more topics like this? Make sure you hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.